Namaskar and good morning, everyone. I, Rilanjana Talukdar, on behalf of Intellectual Forum of Northeast, welcome everybody for today's webinar. Today's webinar on the topic A Role of China in Northeastern Insurgency is being conducted by Intellectual Forum of Northeast, which is a thinking tank formed in the year 2016 by a group of young dynamic individuals with its basic grounded objectives of highlighting and limelighting the pertinent issues concerning Northeast, the region of India. Intellectual Forum of Northeast is a platform for debates, discussions, and for a meaningful discourse, inclined in conducting socio-economic surveys, various research works, documentation, publications of books, journals, etc., etc. This forum has conducted various symposiums during its endeavor and exploring and restoring the rich heritage of our beloved country and presenting it to the rest of the world via the intellectuals of the society is its primary vision. Before we start off the session today, I would like to inform that we would be running a live questionnaire session at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions in our comment box, and I request that the question must be relevant to the topic. Today, our topic that we have, it is a very interesting topic and it is a very vital issue of our country, insurgency, which we have been hearing it from decades and decades. It is very vital in our country. And Northeast India is the most volatile and insurgency affected place in the country right after Kashmir. Analysts have also indicated that most of the militant outfits in this region have been quick to transform themselves into purely terrorist entities. Due to the rapid insurgency activities in this Northeast region, many civilians have lost their lives since 1990. China's assistance to the separatist outfits in this region have been going on since decades and decades, and also has been identified in providing lots of assistance to the insurgent groups. And this type of moral and material support has really led to the success of insurgency. In 1970 to 1990, there was a classical insurgency, which has become now silent, but it doesn't mean that it has been totally stopped. It has changed its new version or face. So it is very important for all of us to know its new version or new face in the country. Now we have a special guest with us. I request everybody to have a bit of patience till our honorable guest joins in. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. Very, very good morning.
Thank you, sir. Today we are, welcome, sir, and thank you, sir. Today we are really obliged and privileged to have you amidst us. Respected Honorable Ravindra Narayan, sir, the Governor of Nagaland. Once again, welcome, sir. We are delighted to inform that Sir has been the Director of the Intelligence Bureau and retired in the year 2012 and was designated as the Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee in the year 2014. And in the year 2018, he was appointed as the Deputy National Security Advisor of India. Sir has played a key role in eradicating the influence of insurgent groups in Nagaland. Sir, thank you so much for your valuable time. And now I request you to take over the session on the topic forward. Please do the honors, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Rilanjana ji, for organizing this.
Thank you so much, sir.
And giving me an opportunity to interact with the members of the Intellectual Forum Northeast. An initiative to better understand China. No, because we have all felt in the strategic community, within the government, outside the government, we have felt the need for better, greater understanding of China. We are trying to invest more, government is trying to invest more in understanding. And so is the need on the part of non-government bodies, academia, think tanks, also to study China. Because, it's a fundamental principle that if you are pitted against an adversary, and China is an adversary, let us not mince word about it, you must have a better understanding of it. Because if we do not, then we are apt to commit miscalculations, and miscalculations can be costly, either in terms of resource deployment, in terms of our responses and all. So to have a better understanding of China is a necessity for us. And in this context, the Northeast Intellectual Forum has taken China's role in the Northeast, how it looks upon Northeast. I think it's a very, very useful initiative, and I would expect that we will carry it forward, because this is not something which can be understood or studied in a session. I'm sure intellectuals, the members of the forum, are already working on it. Many of them must have worked on it far deeper than what I have done. But yes, it needs to be done more and more. Now, when the topic, the China's role in Northeast insurgency came up, now it's when you talk about insurgency in Northeast and China, it becomes a very, very attractive topic. We will start off talking. But essentially, my question would be today, and which I would try to address is, after all, if at all, if the China has been assisting in insurgency in the Northeast for a very, very long time, then why? Must be having some interest. Now, one way is to look at how it has assisted the various insurgent organizations, given them logistics, given them moral, given ideological, given them tactical and strategic assistance. How do you do that? How do they carry on? But it doesn't answer the basic question, why is China doing it? So it's important that we understand China's interest in Northeast. And interest alone is not enough. We must also know what are the China's capability. Because that will, if we try to understand China's interest and capabilities in Northeast India, then it will be easier for us to comprehend what China is doing with respect to the insurgents. So I would like to make it a little more comprehensive by touching upon the aspect, the context of China's interest and capabilities in Northeast, of which, of course, insurgency will be a part of it, a subset of it, an important subset indeed. There's no doubt about it. Now, what is China's interest here? China's interest in Northeast is integrally linked with China's interest in India. China looks upon India as a potentially regional rival, because we should understand that when China, the communists took over China, when Mao Zedong took over China through his protracted liberation war, it was not the victory of communism. It was a victory of Chinese nationalism in disguise. Because prior to that, a decadent Chinese empire, which had fallen in 1911, Republicans had taken over, which was very weak. The centuries-old humiliation that China had faced had actually shaken the Chinese, right from Opium War with the British had waged, then other European powers, then subsequent Japanese invasion. They have suffered over a century of humiliation by foreign powers. And that humiliation acted as a catalyst to encourage and strengthen the sense of Chinese nationalism. So Mao's People's Liberation Army and his campaign was not essentially a classical Marxist have and have nots conflict. The underpinning of it was Chinese nationalism, the sense of humiliation which China had suffered for long. And humiliation is in the Confucian philosophy. It has two aspects. One is it can be regressive, it can demoralize and finish you. It can also be creative. It can also trigger a force to be strong to build yourself. That is the curative power of shame, curative power of humiliation. And that is what Mao Zedong built upon. And eventually, in 1948, he took over. Now, when communist China emerged, its core interest was resurgence of China as a middle kingdom, as the central power, with neighboring countries, neighboring states as vassals who pay tribute and remain where they are without much of interference, but remain vassal and tributary, no doubt. That is the dream. That was the dream which China had and China has even today. That is the problem. When it's rise of China, which is hegemonistic, which has a dream to be the central power with all the neighbors as the vassals, it is certainly not to the interest of others. So then in that dream, India being the very large, perhaps the largest neighbor in terms of population, of course, it is the largest. And in area also, if you move the Russia, its objective right from the beginning has been to preempt the rise of India. Rise of India as a regional or global power. And when the objective is to preempt the rise of India, how does it achieve it? It identifies the vulnerabilities, the weak spots in India. And in that context, it looks upon Northeast India as a vulnerable periphery, which is emotionally estranged thanks to the colonial occupation of the region and creation of an isolation mindset. So emotionally estranged population and crooked political geography carved out by mischievous partition of India. Whenever we think of Northeast, in the strategic community, everyone cannot escape what we call chicken neck, Siliguri corridor, and all these. So it accentuates the sense of vulnerability. So this crooked political geography and estranged population, China looked at it as an opportunity. The objective is to preempt the rise of India. Spots, weakest spots. One weakest spot is Northeast India. And then with Northeast India, if it extends the idea, the objective is to preempt the rise of India, then what is objective in Northeast India? Its ultimate and ideal objective is dismember it, break it. And it faced a strange population at that point of time when in the beginning of 50s, 60s, 70s, when things were bad. Crooked political geography, surrounded by hostile East Pakistan, and overall scenario was such that I thought that perhaps it could. But if should that ideal not been achieved, then what is next? Next is keep India embroiled in itself. Because if it remains occupied with the very major issue of internal stability, that consumes enormous amount of national wealth and power. That comes in the way of rise of India. So keep it embroiled, keep it embroiled. Proxies, what they call is bleed through million cuts. And in that context, it has been aiding and abetting insurgencies in Northeast. It also has a territorial ambition in Northeast. When it comes to Arunachal Pradesh, it claims as if it is territory. How does it achieve? If the Northeast remains disturbed with internal strifes, then it makes it easier. It seems to be within, for them, in their calculations, within the realm of possible that, okay, if Arunachal had to be taken over, then the Northeast has to be unstable and hostile to India. So this territorial ambition also plays a role. It has an interest. This also adds to the interest of China in the Northeast. It also has another interest in Northeast. Soon after it forcibly occupied Tibet, a lot of Tibetan freedom fighters, they escape persecution and they escape to India. Of course, His Holiness Dalai Lama is the central figure, but so many others. Chusi Gandruk, there is the Khampa rebellion, rebels. Whenever they faced persecution and threat, as a guerrilla, they escaped. Of course, India did not allow them to have a military ambitions or military camps, military training, and we accepted them as just refugees, humanitarian ground. His Holiness Dalai Lama as a respected, honored guest. But China always looked at India with a lot of suspicion that perhaps India was playing what we call Tibet card. Even before 1962 border war. So it thought that, yes, if you be smart in Tibet, we will be smart in Northeast. So as a counterweight, as a counter lever to its threats and apprehensions in Tibet, it used Northeast. And later, much later, when the things have started cooling down and when it realized that, yes, all those things are not very possible, then the latest turned out to be that it looked upon Northeast also as a market for its produce in Southwest China, Yunnan and Sichuan provinces, because it can be a huge market. And those areas are relatively less developed in China than others, but they have a lot of potential by which they can export things. So if you look at China's interest in Northeast, in the context of weakening or preempting the rise of India, it starts from the ideal, dismember it, take it away. Keep India embroiled within itself, consuming a lot of national wealth and power, resources. Also help in keep it disturbed to achieve at some point of time your territorial ambition of taking over Arunachal as a counterweight to any misadventure or any disturbance in Tibet, and eventually as a market. So it has a multiple interest in Northeast India. Now, how does it operate and how did it operate in the past? In this region, it has operated through proxies because it doesn't have a direct access. We don't share, forget about the northern border, rest of Arunachal, rest of Northeast, we don't have a border with China. So it operates all through proxies. Proxies are people who are disenchanted. In the initial period, beginning when the birth of a communist China in 1948, as I said, that it was a rise of nationalist China, aggressively militant nationalist China. It, at that point of time, in its neighborhood, especially in Southeast Asia and Northeast India is actually an extension of, or you can say it is the upland of Southeast Asia is so well connected. It is all a part of the one geographic whole. Now here, it inspired. China was inspirational to two sets of people. One set of people who were disgruntled people in the hills, because the hills, after the British in 1873, the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation 1873, which completely snapped the centuries-old socio-cultural and economic connect of the hills with the plains completely. It created a mindset of isolation. Initially, that was with the pro-colonial project of evangelization of the hills. That was the British policy, initiated by no less than the British Prime Minister Henry John Temple. When 1858, the British took over India from East India Company. His speech in Parliament, he made very upset, is that he says it is not only our duty to evangelize India, but it is an imperative for the empire. So with that, the hills were to be evangelized. That was the process. So they had to be completely, their socio-cultural, economic connect with the rest of the country, especially with the plains of what we call Assam, Brahmaputra Valley and all, were to be completely snapped. And that is what they did. And when the national freedom movement started, the first time when they snapped the ties, the neighbors became strangers over a period of time. Because the people in the hills and people of the plains, they were so connected organically that they had sociological, matrimonial, economic. They used to come and cultivate lands in the plains. So they used to have a market, exchange goods and products. Whenever the peoples in the plain, rulers in the plain came under stress, they took refuge in the hills. And when the hills came under stress because of their own internal things, they came to the plains. So it was a very, very thick organic connect. But they disconnected the whole thing completely and turned the neighbors as a stranger. But after the political national freedom movement began, it turned it into a hostile stranger. They start feeding them that, look, the plains are crooked, dangerous people. You have nothing to do with them, and all the kinds of stories they began. They eat pork, they will not allow you to eat pork, all sorts of stories. So over the period of time, British occupation, the hill people grew and lived in a total isolation from the rest of the country. And after the British left, the challenge before India was that how do you integrate that isolated people, those who have been kept isolated by the British, and building the modern Indian state with modern Indian state infrastructure. It also came into a conflict, a dialectical conflict with the existing power structure in the hills. Because when the British were ruling, they had a loose administration. They used to collect the house taxes and all, but they had left their own internal administration to themselves, because that was not a welfare state. There was not much economic opportunity in the hills, so they did not had any commercial enterprise. So they left them as they were, mission to evangelize them, and loosely administer the area, leaving them to their own devices. So a traditional power structure of the hills came in conflict with the modern political state, Indian state. And so they were isolated, apprehensive, and this conflict. For them, China, success of China, Mao Zedong, was an inspiration. You know, if you look at the history of insurgency around the world through centuries, there have not been many success stories. Invariably, insurgencies pitted against a regular state force, they lose. There many times they do influence the policies of the state, but eventually they don't become literally victorious. But China was an exception. There were a few other exceptions happened later, like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Fidel Castro in Cuba. But China, Mao Zedong, success to have a military victory over established state power was a great inspiration. So their tactics, their strategies, how they carried it, became an inspirational model for the estranged people, those who were estranged, the power structure in the hills. Then they started looking upon them, how they did that, learning from their methods. Mao's Red Book became an inspirational guideline. And there were another set of people, mostly in the plains. They were romantic communists. They were, that was the time when Soviet Russia was already, it was on the move, have a Comintern, Communist International and all. Rise of China, labeled as a communist, actually it is a nationalist, but nevertheless, communist, with a Maoist characteristic. So that had a huge romantic appeal to some people. And that was the time, if you look at 1948 onward, the whole region, our Northeast India, Burma, Malaysia, all these were up with the communist uprising. Revolutionary Communist Party of India resorted to large number of assassinations in Bengal and Assam between the period 48 to 51. That's it. Today they are nowhere, but they did. Rise of radical communism. In Manipur, Imphal Valley, rise of Hizam Irabot, though he was not an avowed communist, but his peasants' revolt against the established order had a lot of inspiration, drew a lot of inspiration from Mao. Burmese Communist Party, it wrecked the whole country for a very long time through armed revolution, guerrilla warfare. In Malaysia, at the time it was Malay, when the British left in 1955-56, until then. 48 to 55-56, when the British conducted the counter-insurgency in Malaysia, then Malay. It was Malaysia National Liberation Army. It was an armed wing of the Malaysian Communist Party. Now, success of Mao was a great inspiration to all the disgruntled people around. Later on, it spilled over to Cambodia in 1951, when Khmer Rouge started waging the war. By 59, it engulfed Laos, and in some way or other, many other countries, of course, Vietnam very much. So, as far as our Northeast India is concerned, from 48 till 1964, China was mostly inspirational for the disgruntled people in the Northeast. There is no evidence of China lending direct assistance in terms of logistics or military wares or so. But it was a great inspiration because it was a great success story of the time. But in 1965, when we had India-Pakistan conflict, war. Before that, of course, 1962, we had a war with China. But that war did not bring Chinese, at least we don't have evidence, that they started directly supporting the insurgents. At that point of time, Nagas were the only one. And They had not yet gone to China. They were mostly in Pakistan. They were going to East Pakistan. There is no record of their going to China until 1964. Of course, Chinese were assisting them through Pakistan, but there was no direct connect. But 1965, the war between India and Pakistan, it gave China an opportunity to escalate the situation in Northeast, because then they thought that, okay, here is an opportunity when India is fighting a regular war with its neighbor, okay, create the problem with the Northeast, and perhaps you can dismember it. And then 1965, you should also remember that in the Northeast, the first ceasefire with the Naga insurgents began in 1964. Because 1963 December is Nagaland state was created. Naga insurgency, it became a militant armed insurgency in 1955. Until then, Naga National Council had pursued its objective. They said they're about the stated position was they will do it peacefully. But in 1955 December, they changed the tack and they began armed action. And subsequently, a large number of them, those NNC leaders, senior leaders, they knew that path of violence was destructive for the Nagas. They broke away from NNC and they formed another party. And eventually they formed the Naga People's Convention with over a 3 year period. They consolidated the Nagas' opinion and got the Nagaland state. Agreement for that in 1960 and 1963 it was inaugurated. The state was inaugurated. But undergrounds were not a part of it. Many efforts were made to bring them up, but they were so much engrossed and rather enchanted by the possibility of independence, inspired greatly by China, example of China, that it could not. They did not come over ground. But 1964, an attempt was made, a ceasefire happened. In 1965, we had made significant progress. It appeared as if we were going to have a settlement. And at that point of time, Fizo, Angami Zafi Fizo, who was the leader based in London, he actually wrote a letter to then the Naga army chief, Mao Angami, saying that no, don't have a settlement. Those who are going to have a settlement, warn them. Because, and then he then narrates in the letter, which is of March 1965, that look, China is going to attack India. They're going to drop hydrogen bomb on India, and India is going to be reduced to dust. If Nagaland remains part of India, Nagaland will be reduced to dust. Now, this kind of misleading, this kind of literature was created, and impression was created among the Naga armed rebels by the leaders sitting in London, that China is going to destroy India. And that, at that point of time, when the negotiation with then NNC, that was the only organization. So its armed wing rebelled against the civilian wing, political wing. And it said, look, nothing sort of independence, total independence, we are not going to accept. If you do that, we are not, and we will take on you. You are traitors. And that actually led to the failure of entire peace exercise. And towards the end of 1965, the first delegation of Naga rebels went to China. And China, they were welcomed. They were hosted by the Chinese leaders. And thereafter, several delegations went, several groups went. And they went, one through Burma, Myanmar, then it was Burma. And some of them they went also via Sikkim to Tibet. So Yunnan and Tibet, these two became the centers for hosting, training the Naga rebels. Subsequently, Mizos also joined, they were also taken. In between, another development happened in this region. That was in East Pakistan over the issue of language, which at first had actually rebelled, and finally the Pakistanis did not succeed. When there was huge opposition to a sort of imposition of Bengali language as the language of the country, because Bengalis were proud of their language, and subsequently the election and denial of West Pakistan leaders to give power to the East Pakistan, which actually had won the majority, it led to it escalated into a liberation war in 1971. So this liberation war that started, when it was building up, at that point of time, Chinese again invested a lot in fomenting trouble in the Northeast. In Chittagong Hills tracts, the bases were created for rebels. Bases were created in Yunnan province. There were special air operations operating from Chittagong airport to Kunming in Yunnan. Carry the rebels, the trainers used to come, equipment used to come. So from both sides, through Myanmar route as well as from East Pakistan route, China invested a lot because they thought that that was yet another opportunity to break India by creating so much of disturbances. For Pakistanis, it also helped because they thought that if India remains occupied in its internal warfare, then to that extent it would not be able to commit resources to the liberation of Bangladesh. It was a convergence of interest, and ironically, at that point of time, even Americans were backing them. We shouldn't forget that. So it was a very unique confluence of interest. Adversaries of India, they had come together. Pakistan, China, and United States. And at that point of time, Chinese invested a lot in building the insurgent organizations, giving them their military capability, and a lot of moral and material support. Gangs of 300, 400 people used to go, get trained, 6 months training, they used to come back, further gang going. This kept happening. But eventually, Bangladesh was liberated. And that liberation of Bangladesh gave a setback to the Chinese dream of dismembering Northeast India. But soon, Sheikh Mujib was assassinated, and political change in Bangladesh, it happened in a way that again it encouraged the Chinese. And it remained so until Mao was alive. Though he passed away in 76, but until 78, by the time Deng Xiaoping was firmly established, he established his grip over the Chinese administration. That old policy continued. But after the arrival of Deng, there was a recalibration of policy. Main policy to preempt rise of rise of India, that there was no change in that. The change was the recalibration of their involvement in Northeast India. And then they became more discreet. Earlier they made no bones about it. They were very brazen during the Mao's time. But then they became more discreet. And so the assistance to Northeast insurgents was not as on that scale and in the manner it used to be. Because Deng's thrust was on building China, not promoting communism or creating instability, because if they create instability in the neighborhood, they knew that it consumed their own resources. And he was more serious about, and he didn't agree. In fact, anyone who has studied China knows that communism in China was, whatever communism it was buried with Mao. So Deng Xiaoping of building China, his philosophy of hiding your strength, biding your time, creating a special pockets of private enterprise, creating wealth and power, that became the main inspiration or objective of China during Deng Xiaoping. So he didn't like China to be seen involved in another country's internal conflict. So they became more discreet. However, there was again tweak in that in 1990s when we had a lot of internal disturbances in the country. Punjab was burning. Jammu and Kashmir had flared up, and entire northeast, be it Assam, Manipur, Tripura, Meghalaya, everywhere, barring pockets of Arunachal. I mean, except Tirapshala. I mean, rest of it was completely engulfed in violence. Even Mizoram, though there was a peace accord had happened in 86, but still there were remnants of disgruntled people. At the time, the Chinese again started maintaining that degree of deniability, because by the time, we should also recall that our rapprochement with China, the major steps was in 1991 when Li Fang visited. The Chinese premier came to India, 1991 December. Prior to that, Rajiv Gandhi had gone, our prime minister had gone over there, and they were trying to build up, have some agreement of peace and tranquility along the border, and also they were making some good noise. So while we were making good noise, they were also, with the deniability, encouraging insurgency in the northeast. They thought that at the time when the Kindria was on the western flank, on the eastern flank, in the central heartland, the Maoists also were very, very active and aggressive. So India was in trouble. So fish in the troubled water. They did that. But that also subsided. India weathered that. So from 1948 to 65, it was inspirational. 65 to 78, it was active involvement. 78 onward, it became discreet. It did not disconnect, it did not shun them, but it became more discreet in providing assistance to the Northeast insurgents. And that continues even today. China's interest remains what it was. Its policy has undergone recalibration. Getting an opportunity, it would try to again tweak that and get back to what it was doing. It is learning to adjust with a rising India. And in the process of learning to adjust, it has not given up its larger dream of a Middle Kingdom, being the sole superpower in the region. Later on to the global ambition, but first within the region. Now, what are the capabilities? Its interests we knew. We have seen that its interests are to weaken India, preempt India, dismember Northeast, if not keep the region, India embroiled in its internal strife, consuming enormous wealth and power, national wealth and power, counterweight to Tibet, on all those things. And now, of course, they started talking about in the later part of it, from the 2000 onward, when this situation started again. The Punjab, by the year 2000, Punjab had quietened. Jammu Kashmir also, by and large, the violence was up, but it was over the peak. They realized that they couldn't succeed. Here also, Assam, by and large, the insurgency in Assam had subsided, though there were violent incidents. Assam was still violent, but things were very well under control. Tripura also had quieted down. At one point of time, by 95, 96, Tripura alone accounted for the largest number of killings in the Northeast, single largest. Rest of the states put together, Tripura was the maximum. Nobody today can imagine that. That was the case. It would be hard to imagine. So then they started from 2000 onward, they started talking about market. Build the Stillwell Road, Kunming initiative, connect Kunming with Guwahati, building up by drive. If you come by drive, by 15, 16 hours from Kunming, you reach Guwahati and you fly in 1 hour. So they started changing the narrative. Okay, look at it as a market. But that doesn't mean that it looks only as a market. It just still keeps looking for the troubled water. The moment the water gets troubled, it just starts fishing. Now, so today's capability, if you look at what is the capability in the Northeast India, because it doesn't have any direct access, its capability is only through proxy, and proxies are here the insurgent organizations. Now we know for last almost nearly about 10 years, Northeast is on the path. Last about 6-7 years, very remarkable, visible improvement. Hardly any. I mean, it's difficult to say that yes, Northeast is a troubled area. And by all indication, it appears that with the rise of comprehensive strength of India, this trend of improvement seems irreversible. Democratic institutions are taking roots. The strange people of the hill, mainly, who didn't know India, those who were allowed to forget the past and think of India, rest of India as a hostile area and people, they got to know that after all, this is a country where India is not some foreign power. India is, after all the powers are vested with the state. After all, what is the power with central government? Of course, they may have power like some key powers, but if you come to think of it, in our federal system, the bulk of power is vested with the state. Your land, resources, everything is yours. Education, health, and whatnot. And they realize that, okay, well, it's their own people who are governing. They are running that administrations the way they want. They make laws. So, greater awareness about India, the modern Indian state infrastructure taking roots within the people. All these have created, of course, better connectivity, economic rise of India, getting greater economic opportunities for the people and the produce of the region. All this together has improved the situation remarkably. It is difficult to imagine today that there was a time when we used to lose about 2,000 people every year in insurgency violence. Today it is single or maybe at the most lower double digit, hardly any case that is reported. So things have improved. So the China's capability to influence the situation here and create trouble is limited. But at the same time, the disgruntled elements here, they play upon the psychology, because the Mao's strategy, guerrilla strategy, there are two weapons. One is the weapon that arms, but the second, which is more powerful than that, is propaganda, psychological warfare. Because a guerrilla organization is invariably pitted against a much larger state power. So it knows that militarily it cannot match. What it can achieve it can prevent the state at the most from running its writ fully by keeping the area disturbed. But beyond that, what it does, it relies much more on propaganda. That is psychological operations. That is why we find even today, people here, some disgruntled elements will try to raise the issue of China bogey. And it's very important for us to understand what China can do today. Otherwise, if we don't understand it fully, we will be carried away by that bogey, the fear, as if China's capability to meddle and interfere in the Northeast is hugely diminished. Mostly, well, you will find many times you will find some people, armed people, group of them going to and then coming up with the big news that they have come to China, they have gone to China. Now, take the case even in Assam, Paresh Barua. What is Paresh Barua's strength? People of Assam have rejected him. But occasionally he says, okay, he's in China. So he's in China means what? You know, even some Naga rebels have gone over there. So what? China knows that it cannot fight a war for these people. Some of these insurgent leaders, those who are still not come to a settlement, some of them they used to raise sometimes. Yes, you know, Mr. We have our friends. I used to laugh at them. I said, look, I know you have your friends. But do you realize that your friends will use you like a fly to spoil my cup of tea? Because your friend is not going to fight your war with us. They will use you. You will suffer in the process. And at the most, it can spoil my cup of tea. So we should understand that China's capability to meddle in Northeast is hugely reduced. It is not finished, of course, it is not finished, but it is hugely reduced. So when we think of, when these people raise a bogey of China, we don't necessarily have to get perturbed with, okay, as if there is going to be, this is a major threat. It's not so. India of today is not what it was 20 years back or 15 years back or 50 years back. We are far more confident today. So what should be our strategy? We know that China's interest in the region, China's capability in the region. What do we do now? What should be our strategy? India's strategy, which is not only for Northeast, but the whole of the country, is grow stronger. There is no substitute. And Prime Minister Modi's mission right from his first term has been to make India stronger. Even the latest Atmanirbhar Bharat is a huge move towards making India strong. Stronger. You know, because in the entire international geopolitics, there is no substitute to strength. If you are strong, you have friends around. There is a very well-known sloka, Sukraniti, Balino Vasga Sarve, Durbalasya Chasatruva. If you are strong, you have friends around. If you are weak, all are your enemies. Grow strong. The classical Melian dialogue, the Greek, Peloponnesian War, those who have studied the Greek history. Thucydides, the great Greek military historian, when this in the 416 BC, when Spartan and Athens they clashed, before the fight, there was a small island, call it a country, Melos. Athens told them, look, they went and said, look, surrender to us. Melos wanted to be neutral. He said, no, we will not be party to either, because traditionally they were related to Spartans. They had a relation with the Spartans. But the Spartans were a weaker party. But at the same time, they knew that the fight would be bitter. So they chose to be neutral. Athens told, no, you can't. And then in the process of discussion, the Melian dialogue, I suggest those of you who have not read it, please go through that. The dialogue between the Athenians and Melians. When Athens said, you surrender or we will conquer you. You have no third option. And then the sum and substance of that Melian dialogue is, mark these words, the strong do what they can and weak suffer what they must. A strong do what they can, what they have a strength to do, and weak suffer what they must. So grow strong. All our problems in the past has been because of our weakness. We have to grow strong. That is applicable, and that will settle all our issues. Don't have to worry too much about it. And in the context of Northeast, strengthen our emotional and economic integration, the bonding with the rest of India. You know, there have been a lot of damage to our national fabric caused by the British. It has to be repaired. We have to strengthen our emotional and economic bonding of the Northeast with the rest of the country. And the counterinsurgency thrust must shift from military to the police. You know, most of our counterinsurgency doctrines, methods, were hugely influenced by British counterinsurgency operations in Malaya. Harry Miller book, The Menace in Malaya, is a classic, it's a textbook for all the counterinsurgency. When Americans had to draw a lot upon that, how they did. But we have realized over the period of time that it becomes counterproductive. So long we were operating on a foreign soil, so long the British were operating in Malaysia, so long the Americans operated in Vietnam or Iraq or sort of Afghanistan, that's a different story. But when you are dealing with your own people, it cannot be. That formula is not. I strongly reject that. It has a very limited validity, but I can assure you that initial literature, if you look at the counterinsurgency literature, it was hugely influenced by that Harry Miller's Menace in Malaya. That is the British counterinsurgency operations in Malaya. Now we have to move away. We had to be by the police. Even in Nagaland context, earlier times, when after creation of Nagaland state, the Naga rebels, they were more apprehensive and fearful of Naga armed police, not so much of the military, Indian military, because military had a handicap of intelligence. As a result, when they had intelligence, they operated. There were significant collateral damages. That gave a lot of sympathy to the underground rebels. Whereas the Nagaland armed police, when they operated, they did surgical strike and targeted, dropped the target, came back. So counterinsurgency has to shift from military to police. And we have ample armed police. In fact, some of the states have a huge number of armed police. In Nagaland, of course, the number is far more. Police per capita, population ratio is the highest in Nagaland, even higher than the internationally accepted norms. But the point is that we need to. So our strategy has to be grow strong. India has to be strong. With respect to Northeast, emotional and economic bondings, and counterinsurgency to shift from military to police. Now, we need to do certain tangible measures. What else? If you further translate it, how do we do it? Going stronger, of course, government Prime Minister is doing that in a larger scale, much with the various schemes. And Atmanirbhar Bharat is the latest one. But in context of Northeast, we can make Northeast as an economic hub, building on its own natural and human resources. It has a very, very rich, both human as well as natural. Northeast can be an economic hub. We can build it. And massive connectivity infrastructure. Still, there are large tracts in the region where we don't have roads. And an area which is not connected has no presence of, there's no presence of state. Forget about it. Whatever may be the sermon, the fact is that the area is not connected by road. It remains out of the reach of the state. The state has not reached there. So we have to build massive infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, surface, digital, air. Now, while we have, it was a news this morning that from Chittagong port we are bringing things to, we have brought container to Tripura. Excellent. We should build on that. At the same time, we also need to build our internal connectivity. So, among the tangible steps that I would suggest is turn Northeast into an economic hub and build massive infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, or surface, rail, road, air, digital, and of course, Bangladesh or Myanmar, massive connectivity. But there is a need for taking some intangible measures, because that's not enough. And among the intangible measures that we need to take with respect to Northeast, first and foremost is detoxification of history. A false history has taken root in the region. False history. It has replaced the genuine true history. The Northeast was not since the British came. Northeast has been there for thousands of years. We have all those period of organic connect. But today it appears as if they are a distinct land, distinct people. Also, detoxification of history, which has to be done. And restoration of civilizational connect. Just remove the thin layer of ignorance today or false history, and you will see, we all see, how through our mythology, how through your folk tales, how through our philosophy of nature, to ourselves, to our fellows, to our neighbors, how the whole of the Northeast, including the hills, I'm talking about the hills, is so connected. 2 years back, Prime Minister took an initiative. We have Idu Mishmi tribe in the hills of Arunachal. They believe that Rukmini was from there. Now, who carried the tales that Rukmini was from there among the Idu Mishmi tribes of Arunachal Pradesh in the hills? Certainly, it was not during the British time, because British had actually disconnected the whole area. It must have gone long back. So the Prime Minister when it was restored, and then at near Dwarka, then they have in the Chaitra Maasa Paksh, Saptami, Ashtami, Navami, when there is a festival where the Lord Krishna's marriage is celebrated, the parties start going for Arunachal from that area and participating in it. It was there. It has been obliterated deliberately. All the areas. This is one example. So we have to detoxify the false history and restore the civilizational connect of the region with the rest of the country. I think it will take us a long way. We don't have to worry too much about China. Anyone tries to play a China bogey in Northeast, all that we need to do is to laugh at it. But at the same time, we need to build on the fact that yes, we need to assimilate, we need to integrate the people. Those who were integrated, unfortunately, during the Corona time, disintegration happened, and subsequent to that, we have been carrying on, we have been following those very philosophy ideology which the British had left. isolation. We keep them in isolation. That was our policy. That has done enormous damage. So, friends, I like to stop here. Take your questions. I have tried to give a broad context of China's interest and capabilities in Northeast, taking beyond the realm of insurgency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your great, interesting, and very, very impactful, powerful speech. The information that, sir, you have delivered now was really very, very informative. We came to know about certain facts, probably which we're totally unaware. We should understand and realize that northeastern states are very, very vital part of India, and we need to protect it anyhow from the insurgents and from the hidden propagandas of China. And as Sir has said, you have said, we need to make India stronger and stronger by building Northeast into an economic hub and building massive connectivity infrastructure. Thank you so much, sir, for your speech. Sir, we would like to carry forward for the questionnaire session. Can we proceed, sir?
Please.
Thank you so much, sir. Firstly, I've noted a few questions. First question goes to you. Is there any role of China in cross-international smuggling of cow, coal, uranium, etc.?
Look, a smuggling of China, let's say smuggling of cow. China's role, ridiculous. I will not accept that. Smuggling has been there going to Bangladesh, that is a fact. Yes. And it's a very difficult challenge to stop it because it's a $1 billion project, in fact. By any estimate, at one point of time, more than 1 million cattle used to be taken to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh meat and leather industry has been thriving on it. And the system that we had was not very strong enough because the economics was so powerful that security measures taken by the border guarding force were not very, very effective. We know how the border villages were involved in it. They used to have a kuti system where the cattle used to come from far inside the country, and they used to be tied in the different households, and they were paid on the daily basis how many cattle is to each house. So they had developed vested interest. If they allowed even the field for them to pass through, and at an appropriate time when they see there is a gap in the security, they just smuggle it inside. So it was a huge economic activity going on. Now, fortunately, we have taken a strong measure that this government has taken, and it has reduced considerably. But I would not say that China has a role in that. I'm not at least aware of it. I'd like to be enlightened if anyone has been this. As far the uranium is concerned, uranium smuggling, there have been time and again reports have been coming. We have uranium in certain parts of the world, especially in the West Khasi Hills. There's an area in the northeast where we have uranium. It's a rich deposit of it, and not yet tapped because we don't need to, because we have as such enough of uranium which we are getting from after that we had the deal with some of the countries, the supplier countries. Now, there have been time and again some small packets alleged as uranium. Many times on testing, they did not confirm that they were uranium yellow cake. Now, I would not say that China is involved in a smuggling of uranium from Northeast, because there is no evidence as such that those mines, the West Khasi Hill mine, where we have the deposit, are getting depleted. And smuggling cannot happen in packets of 1 kg, 2 kg, because it cannot be raw uranium. I mean, if it is a mineral, it is so thin dilution that it is inconsequential. It has to be taken in tons and tons, metric tons, processed and then taken out grams and milligrams. So I think as yet, a smuggling of uranium from Northeast, we don't have any credible evidence to sort of suggest that. And as far as cow is concerned, I don't think China is involved in that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The next question to you is that there was a decade when army-based insurgency in Northeast was prevailing, but now it has almost fallen off. So what is the new phase of insurgency or strategy of China to implement their strategical move to create disturbances in Northeast and all over the country?
Yeah, look, what now China is doing is influence the popular opinion within an area, within the country, or if there is a, against any progressive policy of the government. Let's say, I'm giving you an example, and some people who are associated with this might take offense at it. Well, it's up to them. Now you are building a dam. Electricity, power is a crucial to development. Clean energy. Coal is not a clean energy. Hydro is, of course, it has its own limitations, but Northeast has enormous hydro potential. There are quite a few of our dams with a very major capacity. They are stalled on the issue of environment. No, so creating such groups, raising the fear of the people against that, well, if you build the dam is going to, once sometimes it breaks and then you are finished. That fear. So operating through pressure groups, creating pressure groups, operating through pressure groups, and preventing or delaying the projects, development projects. Here we find very clear, the involvement of China. They try to do it very smartly, but well, after all, they are not only smart. One gets to know, yes, this is how you are doing it. So today their strategy is influencing the public opinion. If you want to start something, do something in a particular area of your country, there will be opposition to that. Opposition to that will not be from foreign country directly by your own people, but our own people are being misled. And a nucleus of them, some of them would be direct beneficiary of that. But the rest of the people, the people, they get swayed. So influence building is today is the major tool of China in growth of this country. There are other ways, as we also say, but we have apprehensions, and generally so, about how to sharpen the tool of influence operation, influence building. For that, data becomes very important, because now it is an age of precision targeting. It's not that generally you have kind of big pamphlet that, okay, this is, you also target people with precision, according to their taste, according to their likes, dislikes, orientation, intellectual orientation, political orientation. So once you have, so the data becomes very, very important. So collecting all those data, and then through precision targeting for influence building, influence operations. In fact, China has a very has a department. Of course, it has multiple units. United Front Works Department for sort of essentially for these influence operations overseas. So today, their strategy has shifted to build influence in the country, in the target country, by co-opting people in that very country who are either influential or who can be made influential. They also pick up people right from the young age, a student, bright student, a student leader. He has a sharp eyes. They start targeting those people, and those people unwittingly, they some of them, they genuinely believe that they are driven by their own, sort of conviction. So this has become, influence operation has become so subtle today that I am being manipulated without my knowing that I'm being manipulated. It's like a Tolstoyan dilemma of free will and sort of necessity. But I'm as if I believe as if I'm doing out of my own choice. But that's not my. I am being manipulated. So this subtle area which has gone into, with its capacity with the technology in which they have invested a lot, the cyber domain. They're working mostly in influence building and disrupting the projects of development.
Next question to you, sir, is that there is the strategical term bleed India in 1,000 cuts, which is used by Pakistan military. And nowadays, China seems to be the guardian of Pakistan. So could you please explain us the exact definition of bleed India in 1,000 cuts and which kind of 1,000 cuts will be to our country and in which of the location?
The bleeding through 1,000 cuts we often attribute it to Pakistan as if they are the one of it is actually the Chinese philosophy.
Okay,
in fact, what it is an offshoot of their strategy to work through proxies.
Okay.
Create as many proxies of yours within the target country as possible and bleed that country. That in fact when the East Pakistan people, that is the present Bangladesh people, were revolting against Pakistan. The Chinese used to advise them that, look, you guys, you are very poor at creating proxies. In fact, many of the internal resistance in Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, against Bangladesh liberation movement people was through creating various groups was a Chinese idea. It is not the Pakistan military. Pakistan military has a limited capacity or experience to do that. Actually, the Chinese have experience. They had succeeded in their guerrilla tactics. How they destroyed and overpowered the big national army. So they thought that, look, they were the experts, others were not. So they started indoctrinating children. Now, what are those cuts that they have in mind, or they can play upon it? Actually, they play upon certain, and we have a lot of, you call it fissures turning into fault lines. Whether every community would like to have a homeland, whether today, let us say Punjab, at Punjab for a very long time it was for Khalistan movement. They believe that yes, they will have a separate Khalistan, and that would be for the good of the Punjab people. Punjab people finally rejected it. Similarly, we have issues even playing upon this communal, let us say jihadis. What you have radical Islam, as we call it, sort of fundamentalism feeding them. Even the divide, the social fault lines, which is actually fault lines have been created by the British, Aryans, Dravidians. We have a major issue in the south, in Tamil Nadu. Let us say Tamil Nadu is so integrated in the country for thousands of years, and yes, still there are some radicals there who believe that yes, we are different. The continuum, India as a continuum, has been challenged very seriously during the British period by creating huge volume of literature to create a divide. When the British came to India, it was not that they brought their soldiers, the company, their soldiers and all. Another very powerful soldiers which they brought was thousands of anthropologists. Anyone who is doing graduation, post-graduation in any of the British or American universities for doing their dissertation, MPhil or PhD, they would come to India. They would be given a particular district. Okay, you go and study that district people. And there they will study how this village people tie up their dhoti and how other people don't also tie up their dhoti differently. How they eat. Now, they emphasized more on the differences. And by emphasizing and highlighting the differences, which is perhaps the core of anthropology, they made India into multitudes of distinct people. Now instead of highlighting on the commonality, they emphasize. Even when it comes to Northeast, some people will say, I am really surprised. Where do they get the data? At least I'm not aware. Somebody will say India is Northeast is a home to 200 or 250 ethnic communities. I say, I have not got the data from where you got 250, because they will say that they are all distinct, they are all different. When you say that, let us say, for example, Garo and Rabas are different. You move from Gwalpara to Garo Hills. You see the continuum. You see there is very little difference over a period of distance. Let us say you are talking about 100 kilometers, there will be a difference, will be visible. But if you look into the continuum, you will find it very, very difficult to find the distinctions. So it is like a fish. It's different layers. If you play every layer, has its own individuality, but it is also linked with this, organically linked with the fish. It is like leaves of a tree. A tree has million leaves. Each leaf is distinct. Nature does not replicate, does not duplicate, but each one is tied with a common. Now, this instead of common, so they brought thousands of anthropologists, and it became a gold mine. And this is how we have been looking at those who have been emphasizing how one is different from the other. Even look at what you call Nagas. After all, who gave the word Naga? It's the people of Assam. Because those who came from the hills, they call them Naga. And that is why in the British literature, if you look at Abhor Nagas, Mismi Nagas, because they were all coming from those areas. And that is why some Naga nationally say the whole area is ours. No, that was, no, they started, dividing, segregating people by emphasizing even the distinctness, the differences. That is why the initial British administrator of the region, they were essentially were all anthropologists. All at J.P. Mills, all these guys. They had done their masters in anthropology, and they were brought in the RSCS offices. Now this division which has created in the society, in the country. Now these are fishes which can grow into a forest. Unfortunately, we also have been talking in the post-British India as if Northeast India is a home to 200 distinct people. I find it very difficult. And we have reinforced it, political fragmentation of Northeast which has happened by creating a smaller state. That was a political fragmentation. Due to political necessity, new states were created. But the fact that entire region was one organic cultural continuum, nobody can deny it. If you look at it, you find similarity. I find a huge connect between. I find with the people of Nagada. Other day I had attended the function of a Lotha festival, and I found that homes entire troop had come, and they were performing together, and you find a lot of similarity. But no, now we have a different. You are different. So political division of the states has also broken the cultural continuum and is being looked upon as different. Now these we need to emphasize on the continuum. This is the soul of India. When we call about unity in diversity, it is this. It is not a slogan. The underlying philosophy. When I find a friend, a Naga friend, his elder in the family, when he sits on the floor with his parents and eats and puts some morsel of rice on the side of the plate before he eats, I find the same thing my parents did. In my childhood, I've seen them that they say it is an offering to Mother Earth. How is it different? When the two people here in Nagaland, in the quarrel, they go and touch a plant leaf and swear by it. And that is what we do to Tulsi. Okay, touch a Tulsi and take a swear by it. How is it different? So I tell you, there is so much cultural connect. We have emphasized. Now they will play on that. We need to do a huge course correction. Because Indian state has been looking at the region only from a political perspective and divide of the social. We need to build on that. So your adversary will play on these differences. You are this, I am this. We are different. And we need to overcome that. So they will play on that, all the fault lines. Yes.
Now the question to you, sir. As we have been aware that after banning of many Chinese apps in India, there was a lobby of intellectuals and academicians who were keeping on frequently protesting against the government's decision and giving a covering fire to the media and to this Chinese strategy. So the question is that, is there any Chinese investment in the lobby of Indian intellectuals and academicians?
Oh, there's a huge. It's so obvious. In fact, I tell you, it's not only in India. in the neighboring country, it has to be far more obvious. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all around. Their first the investment is creating lobbies within the country. It is their influence operation. Influence operation is to build lobbies to promote your interest. Your interest is not necessarily your company's interest purely, but also negate the growth of that country and create the dependence on you if the country is doing something. So they make huge investment in that. And that huge, from our standpoint, China, of course, has grown a lot. It's a multi-trillion economy, and they can spend part of that. So there is Chinese money playing role? I won't say that everyone who is opposing is on China's payroll. That is not the case, because many a times our people are also, they get inspired by their own belief. They say, no, no, there is a freedom. Why not? I mean, why should there be about? After all, we have the people who keep saying the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Then you say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Why should you stop Chinese app coming from there? So some people could be very genuinely inspired by all those feelings. But the fact is that life doesn't go just like that. There are, and there is a fairly significant Chinese money getting into this country to build influence, to protect Chinese interest, to weaken any resistance within the country which goes against the Chinese interest, shape the government of India's policy. There are a lot of people who are great admirers of China, rightly so for some reason, but they get overboard. Now, in the last 5 years, you just look at how many people from the media they have been hosted free by the Chinese to, I mean from India. Absolutely taken the whole flight, big hotels, good hospitality, good gift, and then the person comes back and oh, what a great country it is. So this is all influence building. So there is a huge China's money playing role in building influence. Yes.
So another question to you. What is the role of China for organizing Alpha movement, especially in Assam?
Alpha movement, when it became violent towards the later part of 80s, because initially they were a group of people, those extreme nationalists, they thought that no, it started with all this illegal migration and all those things. We all know that. Some ultra nationalists, they came out, and who actually were their patrons. They were patronized by Naga rebels. Paresh Barua. Paresh Barua, if you could, he's the one who is the tallest leader in Alpha, perhaps. Today. Earlier, he was the one who was the fighting wing of it. They worked as essentially an assistant to these guys, the Naga leaders. They were the one who took them. So they were first Nagas went, then they took the Mizos, then they took the Meiteis from Manipur. They went, LA and all. They took them. Subsequently, Tripura, and of course, then Assam, Alpha. They all started joining. Then the Bodos went. The Bodos went. They also joined. So gradually, one after another, they were all taken. Initially with the Nagas, followed by others. And the same thing, the bleeding days with the 1,000 cuts. Okay, let the whole region be up in flames. Let engage the enemy at 1,000 fronts. Let them be busy, occupied, and all that. So they had, in fact, even today, when Paresh Barua, as I said, even if Paresh Barua today gives a statement or his figure, his photograph comes, what is that that hits the people there in Assam? The China connection. As an individual, somewhere the people, those who are still not yet fully reconciled to their contemporary reality, they still see somewhere that okay, here is a man who is hero who has gone to China. But beyond that, there was a time when Chinese armed all these guys, equipped them. Initial training, They did to Nagas, Bizos, and Meteis. Subsequently, these fellows trained others. They did provide them logistics, everything. So China had a major role in creating trouble in Assam through Alpha and Bodo violence, operating through Nagas. And then, of course, subsequently they started having a direct connect also. They had a very significant role. Yeah. All the weapons which was coming to them, it was coming to them through the Chinese route. That they got, ammunitions that they got, trade craft, the battle craft, how the guerrilla trade craft, they all given by Chinese. Yeah. So that was the time. That's what I said. It 1948 to 64 inspirational, 65 to 78 direct. Then it became discrete, and in 90s, when the trouble started in most part of the country, whether the West, Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, whole Northeast, then they started encouraging all these guys. And then they started even having direct connect, maintaining that deniability, that through agency. Not that the earlier times, Mao was the one who had met many of the Naga leaders, top leaders, and they had told, yes, you are the warriors, you are the fighters, you will get liberation and all that. And people were so enchanted. Some of the people, leaders who are alive today, they had met Mao, and Mao had talked to them for long, and they were so mesmerized by that. But after that, they became discreet. It is agency through agency they started operating. That's what they did. So they discreetly they assisted all these guys. Yeah.
My last question to you, sir, and by this we will be ending up the session. What we as the common people can do to stop the Chinese imperialist movement in India?
Build India strong. No, I tell you, it's the body politic. When Prime Minister Modi says 130 crores Indians, 130 crores, that is what he means. Because if I am healthy, my body is healthy. I have immunity. Okay, any infection I can fight. I don't have to worry about it. If I weak, then it is easy for any pathology to multiply within me. Now, wherever a common man, not necessarily a big guy, small common man in the corner, he's a laborer, he's a farmer, he's whatever he is, make India strong by doing what you can do to the best. But wherever you are, make it strong. And that is how India will not become strong by simply building a large military or building a few industries. India has to be strong when we find the people of India have galvanized and harness their energy, small or large. When Prime Minister launched the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, his call was to the last man. He said, okay, the one who is a sweeper, he's as much important and of significance as the Prime Minister of India. As a common man, we don't have to worry about China's imperialistic, forget about China and China, their grandfather will not come if we are strong. Be strong wherever you are, and contribute to your growth, your family, your society, your country, wherever you are. Be more productive member of the society. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was a wonderful session with you. And on behalf of Intellectual Forum of Northeast, I would extend a very hearty vote of thanks to you, sir. You have truly blessed us with your presence amidst your busy schedule and delivered such an informative, influential, impactful, powerful speech over this topic today. Thank you, our followers and all the participants for your valuable time over here. Thank you. Hope to see you soon. Thank you and namaskar, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.